Welcome back. First off, a few people have asked me why I'm doing these podcasts or videos. By the way, it's available as a podcast or on YouTube. I'll put a link to both in the notes. So why am I doing them? It's a fair question, given that hundreds of careers, at least, and millions of members have spent hundreds of millions of hours studying the Book of Mormon. What could I possibly hope to contribute to the conversation? I started working on this project several years ago. I wanted to take a focused journey through the Book of Mormon, learning as much as I could. I had already read the Book of Mormon dozens of times and considered myself to be fairly knowledgeable on it. But I'll be honest, I was shocked at how much there was to learn and how much I didn't know. So, truth be told, I probably won't unearth anything new, but a lot of the information was new to me, and perhaps it'll be new or interesting or helpful to you as well. All right, so we ended the last episode with a trivia question. We asked, how old was Zedekiah when he became king of Judah? I got an email from Dan up in Logan with the correct answer. It's from Jeremiah 52, verse 1. Zedekiah was 120 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. So if you keep reading in Jeremiah, things did not go well for King Zedekiah. He stopped paying tribute to Babylon, which the king saw as rebellion. So in 586 BC, roughly, after a long siege, the Babylonian army completely destroyed Jerusalem. Zedekiah would have been in his mid-30s. And verse 10 tells us, "And the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then he put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in chains and carried him to Babylon and put him in prison till the day of his death." If Zedekiah was only in his early to mid-30s, how old would his sons have been? They would have been little kids. Later in the Book of Mormon, we'll learn that one of his sons, Mulek, came to the New World, similar to Lehi's group. I had always pictured Mulek leading the journey, but he might have been a little kid, perhaps even a baby, or maybe he was in hiding and made the journey when he was older. We'll talk more about him later. But it's interesting to me that it might have been a cloak and dagger type of thing where a small group of trusted associates took one of the king's youngest and fled and came over. So chapter 4 of 1 Nephi begins where chapter 3 ended, with Nephi and his brothers in a cave outside of Jerusalem. So far their mission has been a failure. When they asked Laban to give them the plates, he refused. When they tried to bribe him with the family's gold, silver, and precious things, he kept the treasure and sent his servants to try to kill him. Night has now fallen, and Nephi is trying to persuade his older brothers to return with him to Jerusalem. And what does he say to convince them? He references the scriptures. If Laban and Lemuel were anti-religious, and we sometimes assume that they are, ask yourself how effective the following arguments would have been. So verse 1, "And it came to pass that I spake unto my brethren, saying, Let us go up again unto Jerusalem, and let us be faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord. For behold, he is mightier than all the earth. Then why not mightier than Laban in his 50, or even than his tens of thousands? Therefore let us go up. Let us be strong like unto Moses, for he truly spake unto the waters of the Red Sea, and they divided hither and thither. And our fathers came through out of captivity on dry ground. And the armies of Pharaoh did follow and were drowned in the waters of the Red Sea." That Nephi was referencing the scriptures to persuade his brothers tells us that Laban and Lemuel probably believed in the scriptures. But as is probably the case with many of us, there may have been a mental gap between the scriptures and the world of reality. But his brothers had also just seen an angel, so Nephi continued, "Now behold, ye know that this is true, and ye also know that an angel hath spoken unto you, wherefore can ye doubt? Let us go up, the Lord is able to deliver us, even as our fathers, and to destroy Laban, even as the Egyptians." Verse 4 tells us that they were yet wroth and did still continue to murmur. Nevertheless, they did follow me up until we came without the walls of Jerusalem. As we proceed through the Book of Mormon, we'll find that this is typical of Laman and Lemuel. Although they complain and grumble when things are hard, they generally do what they are asked to do. How many of us are like that, I wonder? We do what we're supposed to do, but when things go badly, we're not happy about it. But we still do them. If that's you or if that's me, then guess what? We're just like Laman and Lemuel. So it's interesting that Nephi wanted his brothers to follow him out of the cave, but once they reached the city walls, he didn't insist on them coming any further. Verse 5, and it was by night, and I caused that they should hide themselves without the walls. And after they had hid themselves, I, Nephi, crept into the city and went forth towards the house of Laban. Jerusalem at the time was much smaller than it is now, much smaller. It was about 6,000 people, but Nephi knew his way to Laban's house well enough to find it in the dark. Verse 6 says, and I was led by the Spirit, not knowing beforehand the things which I should do. So although he knew his way to Laban's house, Nephi had no idea what he would do when he got there. Nephi trying to get the plates from Laban would have been like a teenager trying to steal gold bars from Fort Knox when the guards had already been told you were coming. We talked a little bit about that last time. As Nephi neared Laban's house, he saw a drunk who had fallen to the earth, and he recognized him as Laban. Nephi doesn't clarify whether Laban was unconscious or simply too drunk to stand. His first step was to take Laban's sword, possibly to make sure Laban didn't try to use it. And he noticed that the sword had a gold hilt and a, quote, precious steel, quote, blade. A steel weapon of any kind would have been rare in 600 BC. Sometime between 2000 and 1000 BC, the Bronze Age faded out and the Iron Age began. And most steel weapons at the time were low carbon and it would have resembled cast iron. However, a few Middle Eastern blacksmiths had learned how to make higher carbon steel, which would have made their weapons stronger and more durable. But such knowledge would have been a carefully guarded trade secret, which made their products much more valuable. In a later chapter, Nephi will make tools from ore, which suggests he knew something about metallurgy. But in any case, he knew fine steel when he saw it. Verse 10 says, and it came to pass that I was constrained by the Spirit that I should kill Laban. But I said in my heart, never at any time have I shed the blood of man. And I shrunk, and I would that I might not slay him. When the Spirit first told Nephi to slay Laban, he refused. He had never killed anyone. And yet, here was Laban, delivered into his hands exactly as the angel had promised. Have you ever found yourself in that situation where even though God technically gave you what you prayed for, it still wasn't quite what you wanted? Nephi struggled. We don't know how long about whether to kill Laban. He remembered that Laban had tried to kill him and his brothers and had taken their property, but those aren't justifications for killing someone. Verse 11 is interesting, though. It says, Laban, quote, would not hearken unto the commandments of the Lord, end quote. And I wonder, what's Nephi talking about, or what is he referring to? The only recent commandment that Laban could have, quote, not hearkened to was the commandment to give Lehi's son the plates. Was Lehi in a position where he could rightfully ask for the plates or command Laban to give them up? If so, why had Lehi never seen the plates before? Also, later in chapter 4, Lehi tells Laban's servant, surely the Lord hath commanded us to do this thing, and shall we not be diligent in keeping the commandments of the Lord? So, although it's not conclusive, those two things suggest that Lehi might have been acknowledged by the people as a prophet with some authority. Nephi continued to agonize over his decision, even as the Spirit prompted him to slay Laban. during his visit with the Lord in chapter 2, Nephi knew that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. He also knew that his family was going to leave the city permanently and travel to a promised land. He also knew that after leaving, they must comply with the law of Moses, which was written on the brass plates. Eventually, Nephi heeded the Spirit's promptings and slew Laban. There is so much more to talk about there. Elder Holland focused on that in one of his talks. So I have a lot of probably unimportant questions about Nephi killing Laban. So first, how did he cut off his head? Nephi says he took Laban by the hair and smote off his head with his own sword. And I had always pictured him swinging the sword like a baseball bat and removing Laban's head with a single stroke. But you can't swing and decapitate someone with one hand while holding their hair in the other. There just isn't enough room. There's not enough room for a swing. So the only way to behead someone while holding their hair is basically to saw their head off. Similar to how terrorists execute their victims, and I apologize. So second, how did Nephi get clothes and armor from Laban without a conspicuous amount of blood? Being decapitated is a messy way to go. But, Nephi was near Laban's house, and nothing in the chapter indicates that Laban was wearing armor when Nephi found him. So Nephi might have gone inside and put on Laban's clothes and armor before proceeding to the treasury. That seems unlikely, though, because if Laban wasn't wearing his armor, Nephi could have impersonated him without killing him. Either way, I still wonder how he avoided making a mess, and even though Nephi hung on to Laban's sword for a long time, there's not really any indication that he did of what he did with the armor. Okay, so after he has killed Laban, he disguised himself as Laban, and then while walking to the treasury, Nephi says, "I saw the servant of Laban who had the keys of the treasury." Nephi was not a stranger here at Laban's house. He could find his way there in the dark. He knew which servant had the keys to the treasury, and he knew how to impersonate Laban, or his speech. He says, quote, I spake unto him as if it had been Laban. Now, personally, I'm curious whether he was impersonating a drunk Laban or a sober one. My guess is sober, because otherwise the servant might have questioned the wisdom of visiting the treasury while drunk. But anyway, Nephi told the servant that he needed to carry the brass plates to his elder brethren outside the city walls, and he asked the servant to join him. The servant thought the phrase elder brethren meant the Jewish elders, because, as Nephi said, he spake unto me many times concerning the elders of the Jews. So when Laban and Lemuel saw a large armored figure walking through the dark toward them, they assumed it was Laban. Nephi called after them. Laban and Lemuel stopped running, but Zoram is the servant's name, Zoram began to tremble and was about to flee. But, Nephi says, quote, having received much strength of the Lord, therefore I did seize upon the servant of Laban and held him that he should not flee. Verse 32, and it came to pass that I spake with him, that if he would hearken unto my words, as the Lord liveth and as I live, even so that if he would hearken unto our words, we would spare his life. All Zoram had to do for Nephi to spare his life was to listen. Nephi must have known that Zoram would want to go with them. Verse 33, and I spake unto him even with an oath, that he need not fear, that he should be a free man, like unto us, if he would go down in the wilderness with us. And I also spake unto him, saying, surely the Lord hath commanded us to do this thing, and shall we not be diligent in keeping the commandments of the Lord? Therefore, if thou wilt go down into the wilderness to my father, thou shalt have place with us. Zoram's life must not have been terribly enjoyable to immediately be willing to go with Nephi and his brothers into the desert in exchange for being a free man, or perhaps Zoram was now in danger because of the plate's disappearance on his watch, or perhaps Zoram already knew Lehi and his family and felt comfortable going. Verse 36 talks about Nephi's motives in detaining Zoram, but the verse is a little ambiguous. It says, "Now we were desirous that he should tarry with us for this cause, that the Jews might not know concerning our flight into the wilderness, lest they should pursue us and destroy us." When I say it's ambiguous, here's what I mean. He says our flight into the wilderness. Now, does that mean when Lehi fled Jerusalem originally, or does he mean their flight with the city record now after killing Laban? Continuing on to chapter 5. Nephi and his brothers and Zoram returned to Lehi and Sariah in the wilderness. Sariah, knowing what they were up to, was convinced they were dead. After they had been gone for several days, she probably started to panic. But after they returned, the family rejoiced, celebrated, and made burnt offerings. Sariah was worried because she fully understood the impossibility of the task her boys had been assigned. In verse 8 she said, "Now I know of a surety that the Lord hath commanded my husband to flee into the wilderness. Yea, and I also know of a surety that the Lord hath protected my sons and delivered them out of the hands of Laban, and given them power whereby they could accomplish the thing which the Lord hath commanded them." And after this manner of language did she speak. It's interesting that she used Nephi's phrase, whereby they could accomplish the thing which the Lord hath commanded them. Kind of makes you wonder if maybe that's where Nephi got it. Had he heard his mom talking, using that phrase before? Makes you wonder. Lehi examined the plates and discovered their contents. They had, we talked about this last time, the 5 books of Moses, the record of the Jews from the beginning, even down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah. In other words, they were a current document. The writings of the holy prophets from the beginning, even down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah, including some from contemporary Jeremiah. The genealogy of both Lehi and Laban, and perhaps other prominent citizens in Jerusalem. And, just to reiterate from last time, Nephi's story began in the first year of the reign of Zedekiah, and both the record of the Jews and the writings of the holy prophets were kept down through the reign of Zedekiah, so they were current. And this is how Nephi concludes the episode of the brass plates. Verse 20, "And it came to pass that thus far I and my father had kept the commandments wherewith the Lord had commanded us. And we had obtained the records which the Lord had commanded us, and searched them, and found that they were desirable, yea, even of great worth unto us, insomuch that we could preserve the commandments of the Lord unto our children. Wherefore it was wisdom in the Lord that we should carry them with us as we journeyed into the wilderness towards the land of promise." Chapter 6 is brief. In chapter 5, we learned that the brass plates contained Lehi's genealogy. However, Nephi said that he would not include the genealogy on these plates because Lehi had written it in the plates that he was keeping. Quote, verse 4, "For the fullness of mine intent is that I may persuade men to come unto the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and be saved." Just one parting thought is it doesn't ever mention that whether Nephi told his parents or his family that he had killed Laban, or Zoram for that matter. It says he had been delivered out of his hands and he had his sword, but he never mentions that. He might have kept that quiet. It's hard to say. In the next episode, they'll be going back to Jerusalem. So, although people knew that Laban had been killed, they might not have connected it to Nephi. All right, we'll end with another trivia question. This one's probably easy, but it'll give us something to talk about, and it has some interesting implications. So, here's the question. How far outside of Jerusalem was Lehi's camp? If you know the answer, email your answer to bomjourney@gmail.com. That's the letter BOM, and then spell out journey. There's no spaces or underscores in between, just bomjourney@gmail.com. Include your answer, also your source. and we will plan to see you next time.